Good evening, folks. Welcome to you from wherever you are zooming into the MCC at 100 conference. My name is Wendy Kroeker. I'm a professor at Canadian Mennonite University, and I am pleased to be with you for this evening for the panel entitled MCC and Indigenous-Settler Relations in Turtle Island. Before we begin with the panel, let me introduce the interim president at University of Manitoba, James Currie, for some opening remarks. Hello, James. We are so glad that you're with us this evening. Please.
Thank you, Wendy. Just one moment while I organize myself, sorry. Good evening. So I am Dr. James Currie, interim president and vice chancellor of the University of Winnipeg. And it's a privilege to welcome you to this evening's discussion, Mennonite Central Committee and Indigenous-Settler Relations in Turtle Island. It's important to acknowledge that the university is located on ancestral lands, on Treaty 1 territory, and our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. These lands are the heartland of the Métis people. The University of Winnipeg is committed to partnering with Indigenous peoples and expanding knowledge related to the rights and responsibilities of people in this area. Thank you to Dr. Ben Nobbs-Thiessen, Chair in Mennonite Studies, for his role in organizing this conference, hosted by the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies with support from the Mennonite Central Committee. The University of Winnipeg and the Mennonite Central Committee share a commitment to peace, justice, and reconciliation. We're committed to working together as a community to listen, learn, and respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. We're grateful to Wendy Kroeker for chairing tonight's discussion. As we recognize the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, conversations like this are vital. Time has been set aside today to honor survivors and their families, to ensure that public commemoration of the history and heritage of residential schools remains a central component of the reconciliation process. It's a privilege to have Adrian Jacobs, Mary Jane McCallum, Erica Littlewolf here this evening to share their knowledge and experience with us. This is a continuous process of learning and unlearning, and there is much work to be done, but events like this are an important starting point. Enjoy this weekend's conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Currie, for those opening words and acknowledging that we, many of us sit here on Treaty 1 land or calling in from there. Adrian, Mary Jane, and I for the panelists this evening, and Erica will let you know her context as well. It has been for many of us today a time to gather with Indigenous and allies and settler peoples at various events today to honor our first nationwide Truth and Reconciliation Day. And so to have this session tonight on MCC and Indigenous-Settler Relations in Turtle Island is indeed good timing for this conversation. I have worked with MCC for many years, worked in their social justice programs, and now teach peace and conflict transformation studies at Canadian Mennonite University. So on behalf of the organizers, I'd also like to acknowledge the honor that we have to have Adrian Jacobs, Mary Jane McCallum, and Erica Littlewolf with us this evening to share from their wisdom, from their tradition, to offer teachings to us on this day. Thank you to each of you for being here and what you will offer into this space and for our continued journeys together to see what those might look like together. Each panelist will speak out of their experience with MCC from the Indigenous space and relationships that they occupy. Each will have a little bit of a different format for the 15 minutes or so that they will have. We will follow these three presentations with questions from you, the audience, You can write your questions in the Q&A. You see that button at the bottom of your screen, or in the chat, you can send me a message saying that you would like to be able to ask your question yourself in your voice, and our tech assistant will be able to unmute you at that time. Panelists, I will chat with you to give you a heads up when you have about 2 minutes left in your presentation. So when a chat notification comes up, that might be from me. We will go in the order that is written in your program, which means we will start with Adrian Jacobs, and then we'll move to Mary Jane McCallum, and then to Erica Littlewolf. I will introduce each of them just in front of their presentation, so who they are is fresh in your mind. This is a space that I know is one where you are free to ask all sorts of questions. This conference has been advertised as the past, present, and future view for MCC. And I think this session, for me, maybe I'll say in particular, is one where I think the past, present, and future is something to be grappled with. And we have 3 presenters today that can assist us to do that. So please do engage when your opportunity comes. So Adrian, let me introduce you first for you to begin. Adrian Jacobs is Ganasono of the Turtle Clan, Cayuga Nation of the Six Nations, Haudenosaunee Confederacy at Grand River Territory, Ontario. He is a father of 5 and grandfather of 2 grandsons and 1 granddaughter. He lives as guest here on Anishinaabe Territory, Treaty 1 territory, as keeper of the circle at the Sandy-Saulteaux Spiritual Center. He teaches in the areas of Indigenous history, culture, and contemporary issue, and he has been someone who has come alongside me on a number of occasions as teacher and wise friend, and I am grateful for that relationship. His presentation this evening is about his work term with MCC Ontario in the Aboriginal Neighbours Program as a community liaison educating the Mennonite constituency about the Six Nations land issues in the Grand River Valley. So Adrian, welcome. We open our hearts to what you have to share with us this evening.
Okay, my greetings to you is tonight is Suguli, which means, is your life force still going on? It's an inquiry into your well-being, and it can be often followed up by Skenogoa, which means big peace to you as well. So I wanted to share my experience, not only with Mennonite Central Committee from 2007 to 2010, but from a bigger perspective as well, and questions that are relevant to that connection between Mennonite folk and the Six Nations community in particular. Our first encounter with the Dutch happened in 1613, and we established the two-row wampum belt to represent our relationship with each other. The Dutch wanted to trade with us, and we said we want to establish friendship and peace and strength. So this belt represents the River of Life. It actually is it would be the Albany River, or rather the Hudson River, that goes from Albany, New York, where the Mohawk River comes into the Albany and then goes down to New York City. At that time, it was called New Amsterdam because it was a Dutch colony. And the relationships between the two dark lines here represent the vessels of state of each nation. But the 3 lines in between represent the desire for peace, and then the respect that is found in, or the respect that produces peace. And then when you have a relationship like this, then there is real strength. And so we established this in the beginning. And later on, in 1701, we established a dish with 1 spoon wampum belt that represented the relationship between Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and English folk. And the territory that it covered was, here we can see Southwest Ontario, Western New York, western part of Pennsylvania, the state of Ohio, Indiana, most of Illinois, and then the southern part of Michigan. That was the dish, and it represented the provisions of the land to feed everybody. And the one spoon represented the right of access. In our situation in Six Nations, we had supported the British during the American Revolution, and our lands were overrun there. And so a lot of the Six Nations people moved across the boundary between the newly formed US and Canada into Ontario. And our people came to the Grand River territory. And this green patch of land is about 1 million acres, 6 miles on each side of the Grand River that flows here from Lake Erie and up to the source at Dundalk, Ontario. And this is all that's left, about 5% of the territory. And so in 2006, this lady here with the sunglasses, that's Dawn Smith. And I believe this lady at the back here is Janie Jameson. There was a piece of land that was being developed, and these two ladies decided that the legal course was not helping us. We had the land in the legal system in 1987. Nothing was happening. Our traditional people understood the history. Nothing was happening. So these two ladies decided to stop construction. So they did. They stood in front of the bulldozers and told the people to go home. And so they did. The developers were not happy. So they got an injunction being served here. And the people at the site refused to accept it. And that led to a police raid in April of 2006. And they came with snipers, rubber bullets, riot gear, etc. And there were about 200 riot police that came. And our people resisted them, moved them back off the land, and expelled the police from the area. And then this is a very famous picture of the tire fire that was started. And a black column of smoke is an international sign of distress. So we sent that up. And I saw this actually driving home from Toronto. I was on the Niagara Escarpment, and I looked off into the distance, and I knew that was coming from Caledonia, and I knew that was from our people. Anyways, there was a standoff. In fact, this occurred on Victoria Day, 2006. We had blockaded the road, but we removed the blockade. And then the Caledonia folk created a human blockade and still kept the road closed. So there was conflict between our people and their people. And so the police intervened again. There were about 70 police, and you'll notice that they're all facing the Caledonia crew, because that's you always face the side of threat. On the other side were our people, and at one point we said, if you don't want to open up this road, then we can permanently close it. And I remember that they brought out a backhoe, and they began to, when they first lifted this first bit of pavement, I wept, because I thought we're finally saying no to all of this abuse of our lands. I knew the history from a child, the different land thefts that we were having. And that's as far as it got. They didn't do it any farther. And the women, because they are the stewards of the land, locked arms and stood at the front with the people standing behind them. That was their role as the women. The clan mothers who choose the clan chiefs were there finally in negotiations with the government of Canada, the government of Ontario. Here at the back is my aunt, Eileen. She is a clan mother, Onondaga clan mother. And this man here is Roger Jonathan, and he was a elected councilman. And this is Leroy Jock Hill, who was a Cayuga sub-chief, a traditional chief. Our people had come together, traditional and non-traditional people, and it created a front of unity. And our people brought out these wampum belts, the 2-row wampum here, and you see the dish with 1 spoon as well. Because we said that at the beginning, and our elders always offer the best answers at the beginning, and we didn't change our answer from 1613. And so it was out of that conflict that I heard somebody came from Mennonite Centre Committee Ontario talking about a need for somebody to educate the Mennonite constituency about the Grand River tract and the land. And they had said to me that there were 23 churches in the Grand River territory. So this is a picture of me at the Sterling Avenue Mennonite Church. Had a walk, and Mennonite folk in Kitchener joined them at their church, and then we walked to downtown to the offices of the MP, and then I explained to them I'm holding the 2-row flag and explaining that relationship. So what was very interesting to me was I was introduced to my own traditional government at the Onondaga Longhouse by Mennonite Centre Committee Ontario. So Arlie Clausen, who was the lead person there, she came to the Longhouse. Rick Kober-Bauman, who was the program director, he came as well. And then Kuna, I forget what her first name is, but she was the Aboriginal Neighbours lead person in Ontario. And they came and introduced me to my own traditional government. And then we had lunch after. And at the lunch time, I met Rick Hill, who is a traditional knowledge keeper. And he said, wouldn't it be great if we had a spiritual covenant with churches where the churches could acknowledge Six Nations jurisdiction over their land? They could have a renewable 99-year lease and freedom to do their spiritual work. And that if the church ever decommissioned, the land could be reverted back to Six Nations. So I took notes about that and began to talk about that with the Mennonite folk. And then in dialogue, we added to that agreement and said, well, let's put a term on it, 99 years. And then the Mennonite folks said, perhaps a decommissioned church could become an educational center, teaching the Haudenosaunee history of the land, culture and the land. And then Rick Kober-Bauman, or not Rick Kober-Bauman, Rick Hill said, perhaps there could be a joint management board where there are Mennonite and Six Nations people who could hold the land in trust for Six Nations. And so that was in 2007 when we first began to talk about that. And, you know, I had several conversations, went to churches, got lots of enthusiasm. And it was a good time till 2010 when I left there. But then in 2020, the same thing happened all over again. 1492 Land Back Lane started with on the same lands, the same actions, the same court injunction, the same police raid, the same continued harassment after that. Only there is a new generation of young people who are now at the forefront of dealing with the trespass on our lands. And so my question has been, because I've talked to people since that time, I've gone back to Mennonite Centre Committee Ontario, spoke to all the staff several years ago and to the board members. And I asked them the question, what could have happened instead of more protests in 2020 if churches took up Rick Hill's 2007 offer of a spiritual covenant with churches? And I've recently talked about that earlier this year at a presentation of Mennonite Church Eastern Canada. And then I had somebody from a church said, yes, let's do something. And so I went to, I gave them options of where their lease money could go. And we decided to be in touch with Six Nations Polytech. So we got in touch with them. I met with the president, with Rick Hill, and with Rick Hill's assistant. And we talked about this idea that a church was ready to start sending money, that wanted to sign this covenant. And so they were very excited at the Six Nations Polytech, at this possibility. And it was like, if we could have somebody like the leading edge, first church, the pilot one, to start this process moving forward, we could actually have some tangible activity. You know, today was National Truth and Reconciliation Day, recognizing the children that were buried in unmarked graves by the Indian residential schools today. And there's been a lot of critique of people who are sympathetic, empathetic, because there's no action. Well, this was an opportunity to have action, to have something that is tangible, something that is an action that could yield real tangible results. And so I've continued to bring this idea up, and the conversation continues. My people started in 1613. It's only been 14 years for me now. And so I'm ready to keep on working this way. And someday somebody will actually do something about this, and we can have a celebration. We talked about having a celebration annually where we could mark out the territory, add up the acreage that is in agreement back with Six Nations. We could collect the and keep track of the lease money that is put into Six Nations Polytech, and we could keep track of all of the churches that have signed this spiritual covenant and made a commitment to Six Nations, and do an annual celebration. And hopefully that amount would continue to rise, acreage, the actual lease monies, and the number of churches. So I'm all about action. I'd like to see more action. I'm tired of just tears. I'm glad for your tears. I'm even glad that you're feeling a little bit guilty, but I'm looking forward to you doing something about this instead of just talking about it. But anyways, that's my presentation.
Adrian, thank you. 1613, which perhaps means we need to describe you as someone who is persistently patient or patiently persistent. I'm not sure which is more apropos. But I hear that that patience needs to be turning soon. I appreciate also that you have named that we have things to feel guilty about. And so in the audience, as you are reflecting on Adrian's words, please do think about questions that you would like to ask. You can put them in the Q&A already, or take a note for yourself that you can put that down. You have framed relationships within story, which I find appeals to all of us to hear a story, and there's a way to push through stories that often just words of declaration don't do adequately. How do we hear your questions better? I lament as I hear you calling back to a question of 2007, and that you have to call it forward again in 2021. So you've left me in a very humble and uncomfortable, unsettled space. And I thank you for that space that you're creating with us here tonight. So we will come back to engaging with you, and I will move on to our second speaker. So thank you, Adrian. Mary Jane has informed me that her internet connection might be a bit unstable, so we're just forewarned. So thank you, that's helpful to at least know that. So Mary Jane McCallum is a professor in the Department of History here at home for some of us at the University of Winnipeg, and Canada Research Chair for Indigenous People History and Archives. She's a band member of the Munsee Delaware Nation in southwestern Ontario. Much of Mary Jane's current work is inspired by Aboriginal women's histories, and she is invested in reshaping modern Aboriginal history in ways that engage with Native and Indigenous studies, gender and women's history, labor history, medical health history, and histories of race in Canada. But Mary Jane has also done some research on the MCC programming that brought young Mennonites from Ontario to work with Indigenous people at a hospital in the PA in the 1950s. And that project is entitled, quote, "To be a Christian Witness, the Mennonite Central Committee Summer Service Program and the Clearwater Lake Indian Hospital, 1940s to 1960s," end of title. And Mary Jane, we look forward to hearing your perspective of a story that you had to work to recover because archival records didn't make it to a federal safe place, and you discovered MCC records as giving you a glimpse into that piece of history. So we look forward to your words with us of your work and the questions that you are asking. So welcome here to this space, Mary Jane.
Thanks very much, Wendy. I'm going to try sharing my screen now. Is that working? You can just see the PowerPoint, or do you see my desktop as well?
Just the PowerPoint, oh, okay. But you can put it into.
I'll put it in the. There we go. Perfect. Okay.
Can you put it into full screen so we don't see your slides on the left?
Oh, all right. Let me see.
Slideshow.
There you go. Slideshow, right? There we go.
Yes, there we have it, Mary Jane. Okay. Yes, yeah.
Okay, good. It is saying it is unstable again. And just in case it logs me out, I've asked a researcher that I work with, Dr. Erin Millions, to read for me. She's in the audience. She won't have the PowerPoint likely, but just in the event that I get bumped off. Okay. Kwinganewalomwa, named Dushinzi Mary Jane Logan McCallum, Wak Ninonjiai Nalahi, Shok Wiki in Winnipeg. Nawa Lotaman Wendak Takwa, Ni Ndalanapewi. So I'm a Delaware person from upriver, which refers to the Thames River in southwestern Ontario, living in Winnipeg, and I'm Turtle Clan. I'm a history professor, and I study the history of racialized medicine in Canada in a way that tries to center Indigenous people. So I'm working on a project about Indigenous histories tuberculosis in Manitoba in what we call the sanatorium era, which is about 1940 to 1970. And in that era, there was an important shift in the approach of the federal and provincial governments to the management of tuberculosis, especially among First Nations people. So that shift was marked on the one end with near exclusion of First Nations people from TB treatment. Okay, here's a couple of them here, except for the bottom. And
So Mary Jane, we have lost you.
okay, shoot.
Okay, your voice is back now.
Oh, shoot. Am I? Okay. All
I turned your
right.
video
Well,
off, Mary Jane.
You've
just
had a
to
chance. Thank you, Wendy, for telling me, and let me know again if it goes out. All right. So you're sync on, and oh, there it is. All right. Okay, it says that my video is off. Is that not true?
Yeah, I turned it off. Just sometimes it makes your connection a little faster.
Perfect.
But we can still hear you, so.
Up in 1940. It wasn't until 1940 when there was a concerted effort to respond to high rates of tuberculosis sickness and death among First Nations people in Manitoba. At this time, very few First Nations people could access mainstream provincially funded hospital care for reasons that I've discussed elsewhere. At this time, the Sanatorium Board of Manitoba, which is now the Manitoba Lung Association, partnered with the federal government to manage tuberculosis among First Nations people in Manitoba. And the federal funding scheme was parsimonious, to say the least. In spite of treaty rights to healthcare, the federal government refused to fund Indian hospitals more than half the cost of hospital fees in mainstream hospitals. And this meant that most federal institutions were bare bones operations. With these funds, the Sanatorium Board ran annual TB surveys in reserves, residential schools, and northern communities, identifying and documenting active cases of TB and making recommendations for care. The SAN Board also operated 3 racially segregated TB SANs, and that is here, Denver, Clearwater Lake, and Brandon. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis patients were also treated in mainstream hospitals, especially later in the period, and notably Ninette, which is bottom right, St. Boniface Sanatorium here in Winnipeg, and the TB clinic in downtown Winnipeg. And Ninette was another site for the summer service program, as well as Clearwater Lake, so the 2 on the right. So unfortunately, because the SAN Board did not transfer its records to the federal government, many relevant archives related to this history have been lost. Those that remain are subject to provincial health information access laws, which are incredibly difficult to navigate for those who do critical social science and humanities research. So in this context, and the larger context in which this history is really not that well known, it has not by and large been passed on between generations for a number of reasons. But there's also a number of alternative sources to turn to for this history, including personal photograph collections, museum collections, oral histories, and hospital, provincial, and public media. So back in 2015, and I think I was doing a Google search, I saw a series of photos about Clearwater Lake Sanatorium that had been curated and made available by Laureen Harder-Gissing at the Mennonite Archives of Ontario. And she had put those photographs up there in the hopes that, in her words, our display leads to historical insights and honors the lives of the patients. So I'm going to be showing some of those photos today. And this is how I came to learn about the program that was run by the Mennonite Central Committee called the Summer Service Program. And in 2016, I went to examine a substantial set of records at the Conrad Grebel University College in Waterloo. So here, the hospital I'm going to talk about tonight was in the PAW. So you can see where the PAW is in this pretty basic map of Manitoba. It was called Clearwater Lake Indian Hospital. located about 20 miles outside of the PA, Manitoba. It had about 200 beds and opened in 1945 and closed in 1965. It was a US Army field hospital built hastily in the Second World War and then purchased by the federal government, the Canadian federal government in 1945 to be run as an Indian hospital by the Sandboard. So there's a little bit of a closer map here. We have the PA on one side of the Saskatchewan River, Opaskwayak Cree Nation on the north side of the river. And if you follow Highway 10 up and then turn to the right, you'll see a kind of yellowy patch there. That's, I believe, where the airport, the Army, US Army airport and Army base was, and where the hospital was as well, in Clearwater Lake at the very top. So here's an example of one of the photos in this collection. Using recycled mission and Army buildings was characteristic of the Indian Health Service. And the Army hospital was never intended to serve as such a large institution. The wooden barrack-like structures were only meant to be temporary. And so many problems arose over the course of the hospital's history. For example, there's poor ventilation, inadequate flooring, the heating system was dangerous and a fire hazard, lighting was poor, the smokestacks were too short, which meant that soot and flue gases settled on the hospital grounds and in the buildings. There was inadequate electrical power supply and cold storage space, and the valves from the heating system in the hallways would scald people. The hospital is also overcrowded to the extent that infectious patients could not be segregated, which is a real problem in a PV sanatorium. For patients, Clearwater Lake was far from an ideal place for healing. Due to the hospital's isolation and treatment program, many patients had long hospital stays at Clearwater. It was an English-only hospital, so patients who spoke Cree, Inuktitut, and other Indigenous languages were almost entirely isolated and without a clear understanding of the nature and length of their treatment. There were at least 2 fatal cases in which patients ran away from the hospital. Exercise was restricted more than usual at Clearwater Lake due to shortages in staff. Here's another photo of Clearwater. According to the background information about the hospital provided to the summer service volunteers in the 1960s, quote, there are only a few trained nurses on staff and there are some practical nurses. The remainder of the staff consists of ward aides, both whites and Indians, who for the most part are inclined to be irresponsible and more or less indifferent to the work they should be doing in the wards. There is a frequent turnover in staff, and some remaining only a few weeks, while there are others who have been there as long as 5 years. So many staff members clearly did not see themselves as working for Indigenous people. Rather, many were indifferent to Indigenous suffering and held common prejudices that on an everyday basis impacted their decision-making and treatment of patients. And I'm talking mostly here about the doctors and nurses who worked there. It would have been obvious to witnesses that this hospital was very different from a mainstream hospital in Southern Canada. For the most part, I'm reading the Mennonite Central Committee's records the way I would other missionary and federal records, which is against the grain. I'm scouring for the odd piece of evidence of Indigenous lived realities in documents that were created for something else entirely. I'm also reading with the grain to try to understand the normalization of inequality, and racism in Canadian hospitals and the stark racial segregation of Canadian society in the 40s to the 60s. So I didn't really find that much of what I was hoping for in this particular set of records. The summer service program began in 1944 and grew out of civilian public service activities during and after the Second World War. The program placed Christian missionary youth, more than half these were teenagers, as nurses, nurses' aides, and orderlies in institutions in Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and Newfoundland. People joined with the intent to teach about Christ and teach people to fear for the welfare of their souls. They also joined to raise funds for their education, minus a 10% of their salary, which went to the maintaining the summer service program. And they joined to take advantage of an excellent opportunity for a new experience. Especially there's a lot of nursing students who join to kind of get into the profession of nursing. The summer service program became connected to Clearwater Lake at the instigation of Harvey Taves, the associate director of the MCC, in 1954, when he wrote to federal agents in Indian Affairs and Indian Health Services branch to find opportunities for the MCC. Taves himself had taught at Norway House Indian Residential School for 1 year in the mid-1940s and had a, quote, warm place in his heart, unquote, for this work. Taves felt the need to, quote, serve Christ in an area of human need. And I've always felt that our Canadian Indians are one sure area. If we can lead people to become better Christians and more faithful church members, we feel that our mission has been accomplished. So there's an important history of Mennonite federal government relations that remains to be examined. The roots of summer service may have been a rejection of war service in Europe, but it was certainly never a rejection of colonialism in North America. So indeed, the records bear no sense of unequal treatment or racism that would have underpinned the hospital. And that was rampant in the town of the Pas at this time. To be fair, no training, the likes of which Adrian has just talked about, would have been in play for the workers who went to live and work in the Pas at this hospital. There was no leadership in terms of critically important discussions of inequality and prejudice that was featured in any of Taves's materials, nor was such engagement ever requested of the people who took part in the service. So I get the sense that the missionaries were looked upon favorably by many of the Christian patients in the hospital, perhaps because they were friendlier than other staff. The records and the photographs tend to focus on work with Inuit and First Nations children, ranging in age from 2 to 12 years. And the work included bathing, bed making, washing bedside tables, giving them rest treatment, medications and meals, and taking their temperatures and their pulses. So summer service workers from time to time observed patients' homesickness and knew that patients rarely had visitors and never went home for trips. They acknowledged that their patients' inability to communicate, and they pitied their long stays in the hospital, sometimes up to 14 years, which would have been basically unheard of in a hospital in Southern Canada at the time. However, they also practiced an indifference to inequality and poorer service provision to Indigenous people that I think is characteristically Canadian. Mennonite roles in modern colonial histories of healthcare, education, and labor in Canada are worthy of consideration for those who study Canadian history. And have just a couple of more photos to show here. There are quite a few photos with children. And I just wanted to show if there's more, if there's interest in the kind of work that we're doing here about TB histories in Manitoba, I just have a link to a couple of our things. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Erin Millions, who's working with me on this project and is amazing, fabulous scholar who I don't believe I could do this work without somebody else, and she is, the best person for that role. Canadian Institutes of Health Research funds this particular project, and I'm funded as a CRC by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Canada. I want to thank the Mennonite Archives and Laureen Harder-Gissing as well. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary Jane. Your voice in the latter part of your presentation came out loud and strong, and thank you for the passion with which you told that story, that history with which obviously we here are connecting with. It was an opportunity for me to listen into some new spaces, to create understanding. And so your work in terms of racialized medical care, I think is one, although you're looking at 1940s and 50s, thinking back to this sort of persistent patients. we have current stories that are alarming. And again, that wait for action and for things to change is now a thread that has run from Adrian to you. It's humbling on my part to hear, well, we were at least friendly in that context, but yet not speaking, writing anything about racial or racism and different treatment of the patients in that hospital. And you pushing us to say, what are your roles in the shaping of colonial history in Canada is something for us to look at. And again, I think this is a space for our engagement in terms of the Q&A. So audience, please do some thinking about Mary Jane's right now and think what will be a question for you as you engage with the space that Mary Jane has opened for us. Thank you, Mary Jane, for that. Let me now turn to our third panelist for this evening session. Erica Littlewolf is from Northern Cheyenne in Montana and works for the Mennonite Central Committee Central States with the Indigenous Visioning Circle as a program coordinator. She, and I've Googled you a lot, Erica, is committed to the work of decolonization, authentic relationships, and healing. With your Bachelor of Science in Psychology and American Indian Studies, I see that you apply your education to social justice issues and how they impact Indigenous peoples. And Erica, what I understand is that you are going to take us to the present, to a current space where you are a staff person of MCC and describe your experience. And so I'm kind of holding my breath to hear what you have to say, and welcome your sharing and wisdom with us this evening, Erica.
Don't hold your breath too long. Welcome. My name is Erica Littlewolf. I am Northern Cheyenne. So I am coming, zooming out of Northern Cheyenne Reservation in southeastern Montana. I am currently on a portion of my original homelands, the northern, about northwestern portion of my original homelands, in what is now the United States of America. Along with that, I would like to acknowledge the, along with the theft of land and colonialism came the theft of people with the transatlantic slave trade. People from Indigenous people from Africa brought over to the Americas to serve as labor for the American project, and how the taking of land and the taking of people served a purpose in colonization and the using of people's labor for slavery, and that these are two things that still run the American project to this day. And so just acknowledging people that are still living through these and how they have morphed into modern social justice issues. They have not gone away. And also acknowledging Truth and Reconciliation Day in Canada. And all that hard work that has happened in Canada has trickled down to the United States. And we are also acknowledging it informally within Indigenous communities and social justice circles as a day of remembrance, as we are only beginning our journey with US boarding schools. And so I would like to acknowledge that, and also acknowledge that we are living through a global pandemic, and that Indigenous communities globally are being hit hard by this pandemic, and just acknowledging that in my community, we have just had Delta arrive about 2 weeks ago, and we've already had 7 deaths, along with the about 150 deaths that we've had pre-Delta variant in a community of about 4,000 people. So remembering that although the dominant society may be feeling the need to go back to normal, there is no such thing in Indigenous communities, and we are very much double grieving in a sense today and remembering. And with that, I started with MCC with the summer service program, much like Mary Jane spoke about. I started with my home church in Busby, Montana, and that was about in 1999. And I did that for 4 years. After that, I went and did some mainstream US programs called AmeriCorps. And I did not like those programs because they had, they lacked a social justice, a systemic racism, systemic oppression analysis. And at that point in time, MCC in the US had an anti-racism program. And through summer service, I had gained a lens and a language around systemic racism. And so the position opened up in 2007 on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And at that point in time, I would be replacing Carissa Ortman-Lowen and Carl Meyer, who had replaced Sue and Harley Eagle, who many of you probably know, and some other people that had come before them that I believe that had started in about the 70s. And so what it was a physical unit on the reservation that at that point in time had served meeting social issues, not social justice issues, but I'd say more social work issues. If people needed firewood, they could come and we'd give out small grants to give firewood to people. Or if they needed money for fuel to get to a doctor's appointment, we could help with that. If they needed a small grant for some kind of little project, we could give out a mini grant and do things like that. But as the program evolved, we started meeting with the community and realizing through a discernment process, like, is MCC really doing the work it needs to do, or doing the work it's called to do? And so through meeting through the community, through a long discernment process, probably about 10, 15 years, that just keeps going to this day. But without people from Pine Ridge, people have come and gone from different communities. We found that the community could meet those needs on their own and through other means, and that MCC had access to like a Washington desk. So we had access to policy, and we had access to a United Nations office. And so people in that community were like, you're a church, you have access to this international space and access to, you have programs in Canada and you have programs worldwide with Indigenous people. MCC didn't know it had programs with Indigenous people worldwide at that time. They had programs with people of color, they just didn't know they were Indigenous. But and so we removed ourselves from that community in 2009. And so what we called that shift was a move from the micro work of one community to macro work. And at that time, what we started focusing on more was the doctrine of discovery. Because that's what the community had asked. They're like, you're a church, you're part of this problem, like the root of the problem. And instead of hanging out, like if we picture it as a tree, as the branches being these social issues like lack of housing, poverty, and that's where MCC was meeting people. People were asking that MCC actually get further down into those structures of the doctrine of discovery, and to look at the way that that played out still in the church, the way the Bible was being interpreted to still take land, and the way that churches are still on stolen land, and what responsibility do they have to that land. And also looking at a lot of Mennonites were farmers. And so within the US context, the railroad would come in and clear the land, and Mennonites would come right in. And that was not by chance. That was because the government was asking Mennonites, because they knew Mennonites could settle the land and farm the land and take up the space. And so they invited Mennonites to come, and a lot of that is still happening in South America. And so Mennonites would come and fill the land. And so looking at the doctrine of discovery, the use of religion that started, that manifest destiny, that God had this place planned for Christians and part of this project, without maybe directly realizing that they were a part of a genocidal process of Indigenous people, and then the enslavement of African people. And so when we started looking at that, we started participating in the UN, and the UN, that word wasn't coming up very much. We had just started going to the UN right when they were deciding on using the word Indigenous. Because at that point in time, we were using different words in different communities, like First Nations, Native American, and we needed a common global term to encapsulate original people globally that have experienced colonization in similar ways and are still experiencing that. And so that's how the word Indigenous came about, with a capital I. And so we started attending that, and through the years, about 5 years ago, they actually held an entire UN permanent forum on Indigenous issues on the doctrine of discovery. And so all the churches that were part of the World Church, whatever, I can't remember what it's called, were all there. They sent delegates and formed some working groups and things like that. But if you can imagine how that goes, every church thrives on their ability to think they're different, but they're really not. Like, they all did the working groups and they were excited for like a year, probably after that year, and then it fizzled out. But I would say for the most part, MCC has kept creating those resources through a partnership with the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition that has since formed. I would say we were forerunning, because at that point in time, no one in the US was talking about boarding schools, but we in the US were connecting with our Canadian colleagues, and I attended all the boarding schools. And now MCC, Karen Kaufman-Wall and I are probably the only two people within the context that we're in that have probably attended all those Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Now that just today, there's a legislation being put in that the US wants to do a Truth and Reconciliation process. And so if you think about that, I mean, little Mennonites in the US, I mean, no one hardly knows what a Mennonite is. And now we have qualified people. And so I guess getting up to today, the thing, speaking specifically for a US Mennonite context, is I feel like the education is going well, everything's going well. The Doctrine of Discovery, people have connected that a lot and are doing land acknowledgements. People are, when they're selling their farmland, are giving money back to Indigenous organizations, and there's a lot of things happening from that. But what I see not happening is that deep change. So when I see Mennonites want to give things to Native people, it's like, but they still want control over it. And so for me, I feel like that next level is like, can you give without strings attached? So it's more like, oh yeah, I'll give something, but I still want to tap myself on the back. And so for me, I'm kind of like, wait. You want to give possibly some land back, and then you want to write an article about how you feel good about giving land back that essentially was stolen to begin with, but you want to tap yourself on the back for the good part of what you feel like you did without acknowledging the first part. And so in my mind, I'm like, wow, that's weird, but that would fly. That would be a front page article. And it's like, whoa, like, and so for me, I'm looking for that change. And what that's often referred to is that white supremacy culture, that perfectionism, that we have to be on time with everything. We have to, Mennonites got it bad, you know, that like that. I never know what's going on in a conversation. Oh, because it's passive aggressive. I'm always like, I think something's going on. And then, so I always just go get coffee. That's my out. And just on this call, you know, when we get on and it's a native panel, but everyone's playing the Mennonite name game. And that really is like a white Mennonite name game. You know, I don't hear no Littlewolf popping up in there. Like, and my grandma went to a Mennonite church. And so there's a lot of us people of color, you know, that have been left out of that narrative. So for me, and no one needs to apologize for this, but I feel like that next change, you know, that can really happen, that culture, that ideology that's so ingrained, I think the fabulous thing would be, you know, it's like we planned this conference and COVID planned something else. But then it's like this fervor to get this conference going again, which I'm all like, yeah, let's finish it up. And then the government's like, September 30th, Remembrance Day. And then it's like the natives happen to be presenting on that day. And for me, I'm like, I think what I would have appreciated was, instead of assuming that the natives want to present on today, could we have been asked, is it okay if you guys present today? Understanding that perhaps this isn't fun for us. This is labor for us. So that next level, you know, like, you know, we have this plan. We don't, but what would you all want to move forward with presenting today? Would you want to change the topic? Would you perhaps want to do something else or cancel this session in order to tend to yourselves? Because I imagine I'm a descendant of boarding school survivor, my dad and my grandparents. And so I imagine that the other two presenters are probably affected as well. And so just thinking like what I could envision for the future. And for me, it would be those ideologies of let's change the way things operate a little bit, because we're working on the way that the knowledge we have and those land acknowledgements and that doctrine of discovery, but we can always do a little more. And that is all I got. Ya'ish.
Well, Erica, I did say to you in an email, you would certainly need 15 minutes, and that's right where you have arrived. But I think we could hear you for many more minutes. So we have some time of engagement. So, and you have said you're willing to take questions. So in a moment, we will move to that. But let me just say a couple of comments of what I heard from you that stands out for me, and it gives people time to start putting questions in the Q&A box. A sentence that really, a question that struck me in the early part of your comments: are we really doing the work we're called to do? I might even say, are we really doing the work we say that we're called to do? So our words matching action, and that takes us back to other presenters in terms of this desire to see action. And thank you for acknowledging that this day holds a lot of grieving, very challenging kind of intergenerational memories. Adrian and I met today at an event, and of course, our experiences of that gathering different because of the two different perspectives that we brought to that space. And what you needed today may have been different than this, but I want to say very much thank you for what you courageously shared instead in this said in this space, acknowledging that even just with that invitation or not reinterrogating the invitation, says to us we're stuck in systems where we have the power of determining things, and we just keep going with that. And your phrase that you said many times, we've got it bad. Yeah, thank you for saying that. Adrian, I hope it is okay to share something that was a teaching you gave to me a while back. Wasn't sort of a pushing and prodding on the word reconciliation that I hear from you, Erica. What does that word mean? And so Adrian and I have had conversations about that. And one of the key things for me in a recollection of that is reconciliation means to regain a friendship. And did we really have that friendship? And the stories that and history that you've recounted, Erica, with owning doctrine of discovery, would say we didn't really have a friendship. So how can we reconcile? We actually have to conciliate at this point. We have to learn how to friendship together because we've got it bad. So thank you, Erica, for your courage and your sharing in this space. So Adrian, Mary Jane, and Erica, there are many common threads that have gone between the kinds of things that you folks have shared. And I thank you for that. And it just puts things out solidly towards us in terms of things to engage with you on. So I encourage you to put questions in the Q&A. Let me know if you would like to speak your question yourself. I'll take the first question that's in there right now, which is one directly to you, Mary Jane. So are you still there? Mary Jane?
Yes, I am. I'm right here. Yep.
Okay, great. So Rudy Friesen is asking, are there still some persons alive who worked and served at Clearwater? What does their testimony tell us about intent, motivation, and calling in the involvements of this work? So there's two parts. Do you know anything about any current realities of folks who served, worked in that context? And anything you heard on motivation or intent would be of interest.
Yeah, so there, I imagine that there were. So the program went from like 56 or 57 to maybe 63 or 64, at least in Clearwater Lake. Clearwater Lake closed in 65. And I think that Harvey Taves died in 65 as well. So I don't know exactly what happened to that connection after that point. So under the conditions, of looking in the archives, I can't share any of the names of the individuals who are in the records. But I imagine this would be, a fantastic project for somebody who's interested in pursuing those particular questions. So my particular interests are, kind of Indigenous patient-centered histories of racially segregated hospitals. And so I was admittedly using the records not for what they were intended for. And that was obvious in the course of using them, but there just are so few records that I'm grateful for everything. And those photographs are helpful in placing the context of the hospital, learning about the buildings and the kind of physical plant. But what we're really hoping is that we're going to be able to join descendants of the patients in the hospitals with these histories. Often, because those histories are not passed on, there are many people who died in the institutions whose deaths were not reported to the families or the communities. Lots of people have lots of questions about that. So that's our primary goal. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary Jane. And let me just add that I really appreciated your description of your reading as the reading that you do with the grain and against the grain. And I found that a helpful way to think through how do we process some of the information that we take in. And so thank you for that historian tidbit that you, or process that you shared with us.
Thanks, I stole that from somebody else.
Hey, well, okay, I'm going to steal it now too, Mary Jane. Thank you. Here's a question, an anonymous question. It's for any of you, all of you who would like to respond to it. It seems like MCC has tried to do more work on taking responsibility and action on white settler Mennonite colonialism and racism than MC Canada. Why do you think this is? I personally don't know if that can be verified. My experience with both organizations is that each is trying to work on responsibility pieces. So maybe I'll push it to you folks who have connections with MCC to comment on whether you do think that MCC is taking responsibility and action on white settler Mennonite colonialism and racism.
You know, I actually don't know, but I would say if anyone, if we make this vague and any institution is at a distance from issues, it's probably because they have more to lose. And so I would imagine MCC probably has more of a distance from its money, right? Because these are still institutions that need money to run. And so I think MCC might have more freedom and more space to be able to say things that the particular church can't. Because I think from my point of view, like MCC has this umbrella of, you know, like Brethren, Mennonite Church USA, and like all these different, I don't know, all Mennonite to me, but all these different viewpoints that it can pull from. Whereas I think the church may just have, you know, a narrower scope and perhaps maybe has more to lose. I don't know. That's just a total opinion. I have no clue.
Thanks, Erica. Anyone else want to speak into that? I don't think we are working on dueling organized Mennonite organizations here tonight. I think from comments from all three participants panels, we would say no matter which group you're in, there is much more work to be done, is the message that I have heard. And I think you're right, Erica. Each has its own particular context and space out of which it works, and the kind of relationships that it works with. So my experience, both agencies has space to grow and has been really working hard on publications and relationship building, networking, and those kinds of things. Sharon Wall has a question for Erica and Adrian. How useful do you find working through the church? Do you not sometimes want to simply abandon this institutional container for your actions?
I'll take a stab at this first.
Okay.
Back in the 90s, there was a survey of people in Canada on spiritual identity. And I think something like 79% of Canadians identified a Christian church as their spiritual identity. But I think it was something like 85% that of Aboriginal people cited a church. So it was even higher than the general population. And because we think in terms of both and, it's not as problematic as other people make it, because there are a lot of people in community that they go to the church for the rites of passage for infant dedication or baptism, for marriages and burials. And a lot of the elders still appreciate all of the old hymns, etc. So, and that's because there's this, both and, because that's my family. I don't take a philosophical line in the sand with my family or my friends. It's like, just because Erica doesn't think the way I do, doesn't mean I cut her off and say, no, I'm not going to have anything to do with her. That's not an Indigenous way of thinking. And so I work in the United Church. I work at CMU. I worked in lots of denominations. I've worked for the Lutherans, conservative and liberal. I've worked for Baptists or been in Baptist congregations, Pentecostal, charismatics. I've worked in Christian Missionary Alliance in various capacities and leadership, Wesleyans. And I often tell people, I'm the Catholic that you confess in your creed. Because, I live this way. And I can do that because, well, Richard Twist told me one time, he says, you're the most compromising Christian I know. And I said, no, I just know what both and means, and I live it. I'm Indigenous. I'm born on a res. But anyways, it's like, I work here just like I would work in any other capacity and any other place. And I'm accepted in my community and by my family. And it's not an either or for me. It's both and.
Thanks, Adrian. Erica, you want to take a stab at that too?
I think I've been all over the spectrum with this question. I think there's some days in the beginning where I was trying to navigate how to do my job, where I was going to quit the church probably every day and assumed that the grass is greener on the other side. And then I took a job in corporate America for a while, and the grass was browner on the other side. And so I started and then I think I quit thinking that about the church. But then I think the work that I'm doing is very, unfortunately, the church is the perfect container for it, because that's a lot of where the damage came from. And so I feel like here in the US, ever since Standing Rock happened, a lot of people have left the church. A lot of Native people in the Mennonite church here in the US, as far as natives that go to the Mennonite church, there's probably 10 or less. And so I think knowing that, I feel like it's still meaningful, even though it's not a lot of the constituency, I guess. But yeah, so I think like Adrian, it's a both and. But what's actually interesting is through working through MCC, I actually quit going to church. And I have found new ways of looking at things. And feel like I've grown a lot, that I need a different kind of church that isn't offered to me in my community. But yeah, I like that question. I think it's something that is always on my mind. And I think COVID has brought it to a lot of people's minds, as far as how the church adapted to meet the needs of people that were staying home. Yeah, and so that's always thinking about it.
Thank you. Let me go back to the, just over to the chat to say Joni Sawatsky has said in terms of a previous question that she would want to give Mennonite Church Canada full credit for their efforts at reconciliation and healing. We at MCC Canada have often worked with them on these efforts. And Sharon Wall says, thank you, Adrian. I like the sound of both, and it's not how I was brought up, for sure. There is a question about Mennonite roles in residential schools, and I think that's probably not a question specifically to the agenda of this panelist. So let me just say, those of you in the audience, who I know some of you here have done research on that, if you could put some tips and guides to somebody who's interested in knowing more about Mennonite roles in residential schools, that could be appreciated by some other folks in our audience. And Sharon Wall also says, thank you, Erica. I appreciate your open frankness. Melanie Campen has responded saying, why do we have to give ourselves full credit for reconciliation efforts? Isn't this exactly what Erica said about doing the work without patting ourselves on the back? Well, as others, oh, Adrian, I see that hand.
Yeah, I want to go to the answered question. Somebody asked about the Be It Resolved book, and asked that question about pat on the back. And I talked with Steve Heinrich. He's my friend, very good, close friend. And we talked about that. And I talked about the history. We're both history folk. And like I bring up the two-row wampum because it's history. He brought up all of these issues to say that Mennonites need to be reminded of what they said and called to do what they said. And one of the things that I noted in my own, like I've studied church history, I've taught the course itself. And in my understanding of the Anabaptist background, one of the emphasis that was in that approach to Christianity is the idea of a flat leadership where there's no, big hierarchical system that keeps things going and that everybody looks to. The idea is that the congregation is led by a sibling, not some, hired professional or somebody that's leading it from, a professional place. And the other idea is, I said this one time, it's dirt under the fingernails theology. It's lived theology, embodied theology. And I said that that's what appealed to Indigenous people when they began to understand a little bit about Mennonites. At Six Nations, the Mennonite community, whether modern Mennonites recognize it or not, you have to own your history and not be embarrassed with it and embrace it. Mennonites are known for their history. I was listening to some elders one time at Six Nations at a public event, and I heard the word Mennonite. And being a Christian leader at the time, I just paid attention to that conversation. And there were three elders speaking. And one of the elders said this, he said, Mennonites, no, they're real people. Now, our name for ourselves, like the people, is Ongwahoe. And the literal translation of that word is the original beings who live forever. And it's a name for ourselves. So this man was saying in English, he says, Mennonites, now they're Ongwahoe. They're real people. And you know why he said that? He said, because they care for each other. And the reputation in Six Nations in Southern Ontario of Mennonite people is the whole idea of barn building. That when somebody meets disaster and their barn is destroyed by a tornado or a fire or something, that within a weekend, Mennonites from all over gather together and rebuild that person's barn. And it's that community action that demonstrated to our people, no, that's real care. That's real people care. So to me, you know, when Steve was putting this book together, his idea was to inspire people to be an activist like he is. He's been to the front line, standing with our people, and has been arrested and put in jail and suffered the consequences of standing with our people. I had one person, one mother, come to me in Waterloo from one of the churches after I'd made a presentation about our land claim issue. And she came to me and she had a mother's pathos. And she said, you know, my son has stood with your people to the point of being arrested. And she said, I just want my son to live a normal life. And I understood that pathos. I'm a parent. I'm a grandparent. I understand that. But I had to say back to her, and I believe it for myself as well. I said, justice is normal. And to pursue justice is a normal thing to do. So to me, you know, I look at that book and yeah, you could look at it as a pat on the back, or you could look at it saying, my goodness, am I doing what our people committed us to do? If you are a community type led person, you would be thinking that. You would be saying, our community said we were going to do this. And are we doing it? Calling leadership, calling community, calling the congregations to that kind of support.
Thanks, Adrian. Erica, did you also have your hand up to respond to some of these?
No, I was just waving at Adrian because I thought he was waving.
Okay. I have a new question here. Robert N. says, all of these presentations are very well done and humbling. Thank you for sharing from your hearts. Many churches are often not very involved in recognizing what needs to change. However, I would like to ask, what have you, any of the speakers, found to be effective in motivating church groups to pay attention and start supporting change? What glimmers of hope are there that we can build on?
I think in the work that I do, we do a lot of on the ground, like relational work and teaching with pre-COVID with my colleague, Karen Kaufman-Wall and I. And so we would use the US version of the blanket exercise. But then we started just connecting people that were interested in, oh, I'm kind of interested in this part of the work or this part of the work. And then that's how people just started connecting themselves. So I think that's helpful, but I would always say, and it seems simple, but it's actually really hard, is just being relational with people, going places in person, and telling personal stories is always the best. And I think you think it's like simple, but then you start realizing that when you go out in public, everyone has their head on their cell phone, like me included. And so it's really becoming a lost skill to engage with people. And so I find that it's exhausting because I'm an introvert, but at the same time, it's really effective because it rarely does not happen. And so I think always doing the work, the teaching, but along with the teaching, doing more listening is what I've found to be effective. People want to be heard, people have questions, and just always being willing to take those questions. And I think Mennonites love the land as much as natives. And so for some reason, I don't feel like it's that hard to gather around land. it's harder to figure out how we came together, or the relationship that was already, I mean, I think there's a relationship there, but we didn't have much of a say in the relationship. Like it was a pre-made, like it was a arranged bad marriage. Mm-hmm. Ooh, I just came up with that. Adrian, you can use that for your next speech. Just quote me. And so, yeah, it was already there before we got there. And I think so coming to the realization of that, untangling it, and then trying to figure out, like, where do we go from here? Because many people in the States don't know that. And so many are like, we didn't learn this in school. And it's kind of like, yeah, you're not going to learn that in school. And so many people feeling lied to, and then wanting to feel like those feelings are being felt other places. And so the validation that it's actually super normal to feel that way. And so I think also humanizing it too, that some of these are just what it means to be human.
Thanks, Erica. Adrian, did you want to pipe in to give something to Erica that she can steal from you, or?
The Mennonite folk from one of the churches in Waterloo fell in love with my dad eating lunch after one of our information sessions, just talking together. You know, my dad's not a speaker, but that group of people that sat across from him during our information sessions on the Six Nations land claim that was held in our church invited him to come to their 50s plus group and to give his story about growing up in Caledonia and living in relationship, playing together, working together, being neighbors together, going to school together with non-Indigenous folk. And he had that story published in local newspaper. So I took my dad at 79 years old to his first public speaking engagement to a Mennonite church there. And it all came by eating together. And like Erica said, just that's relational stuff and stories and getting to know people, just one-on-one like that. You know, that's, I'm glad to be able to tell that story about my dad.
Nice, thank you. Carrie Sainer Harvey has appreciated what has been said about deep change and commenting on Mennonites who want to give but still think they can control it. He wonders, what does it look like to give if there aren't strings attached? Can one give without strings attached? And I'm going to combine that with Tina Kaler's question, prompted, I think, by your comment, Adrian. I've been thinking about the role of, or the word guilt in terms of climate crisis, and I've heard people talking about guilt when it comes to Indigenous rights. What do you think is the role of guilt? So I'm going to combine those two comments of thinking through guilt, and please make us feel more guilty. And then this idea of giving, because, hey, we love giving. We've got it bad, Erica, but we still want control over it. So if any of you want to muse in that space, those are a couple areas people are interested
in. I'd like to say something about the guilt because I mentioned it.
Yeah.
I'll just say this, Mennonites, all Western Christians, you're full of guilt anyway. You're going to have it. It's a near theology. It's overwhelming. Sometimes it's just demotivating, and there's no energy in it too, you know, because that's just the way people are in response to guilt. Indigenous people deal with more shame, like our community, our family. We're letting our family down. We're letting our community down. We're not doing what, you know, we should be doing. So there's two sides to it. Each of us deal with our own kinds of, you know, failures and responses to failure. But to me, it's like neither guilt or shame are good in the sense of just being an energizing force. If they turn you towards doing something, it's the doing something that does give you the energy. It's just like the walk today. We had almost 10 kilometers of walking, and it was very tiring because of the heat of the day and all, but it also makes you feel good. So when you are turned towards something by guilt or shame, and then just doing it, there's energy there. So, and I'll just say, if you trust somebody, you don't put strings attached on it. You just let it go. And that's your problem, not mine.
Thanks. Glad you said that with a chuckle also, Adrian. Erica, I see you've unmuted.
Well, I'm just realizing that this is why diet programs probably don't work for certain populations, is because they work off of guilt, and that doesn't work for me. So that's probably why I've never been on an exercise program, because I'm always like, what's that? Like, I know it's a tactic, but I don't know what's going on. Like, why wouldn't I eat that cookie? Like there's some kind of tactic going on, but I'm not getting it. But I think any range of emotion, I tend to think like guilt is, interestingly enough, where people go to when I do a lot of my work, which is very awkward. It's very awkward as an Indigenous person to encounter people's guilt over Indigenous issues. So I always feel like I'm like get a little tense, but I think if it's felt and moved through, then it can be helpful as long as it promotes movement. But when people get stuck there, then it just gets selfish. And it becomes this all-consuming, it's all about me and my guilt. And I don't think anything can come from that. And I'm beginning to wonder now, is that like, when you give out of guilt, is that when you feel the need to stay attached, like you're attached to whatever it is you give? But I know Indigenous ways, the way I was raised, is you always just give with nothing attached, because essentially the only thing you own in this world, if you are to own anything, is your physical body. And so, and when you leave this world, you can't take any of that with you. And so to give, you give without anything attached. And oftentimes we give in conflict. And so it's not that you only give on birthdays or whatever. Oops, I said that backwards. In dominant culture, you give the birthday person something. In Indigenous culture, we give away on our birthday. So it's opposite in the way we think, because it is not valued to obtain a lot of things in life. It's the opposite. It's valued to give things back. And so I think there's a huge worldview difference there. And so I always think like, it's interesting, and it doesn't just happen with Indigenous giving at MCC. I remember one time working in the office, and I was new to answering the phones, and I answered the phone, and it sounded like an older lady, and she had, the little cards at MCC. She had bought a goat, I think, in Africa, and gotten her little card, and she had thought like the goat would have been, maybe like a year old by now or something, and she was wondering if she could get an updated photo of the goat that she bought. And so there is some kind of, I don't know if that happens probably in every place that runs like MCC, but I was like, do I tell her I can't find her goat? Or do I just like cut a picture out of a magazine and send her, make her a nice little picture of a goat? So I just sent her to my coworker's voicemail, like any other smart person would do. But yeah, so there is that expectation of you know, that following through, or we want to see pictures of the quilts we left. So yeah, I think it's someplace with Carrie's question that we need to look into, because when people do donate, I think that's one thing that in MCC, why people continue to donate is because we are good at that follow-up. But how can we tweak that a little bit to not be detrimental to the communities that may not be culturally appropriate? So I think as we move that direction, I think those are some of the things we need to think about in fundraising.
Thanks, Erica. Terry Miller has commented, in Terry's experience, there's a need to move outwards, rooted in a positive self. Guilt paralyzes, and self-acceptance opens you to others, is Terry's comment. Well, let me ask a question, and it'll just give some time if someone else, we're nearing the end of your chance to ask these three amazing folks some questions. Murray Sinclair, former Senator Murray Sinclair, was interviewed by Rosanna Deerchild today on CBC for TRC Day, Truth and Reconciliation Day. And he reiterated something he said when he submitted the TRC report in 2015. That he didn't think that he would see reconciliation in his lifetime. But he added after that, saying, and I quote, "But if we make a concerted effort, then eventually we will be able someday to wake up and, to our surprise, find that we are treating each other in a way that was intended when contact was first made." End of quote. And that had me thinking about something that you offered, Adrian, saying that you wanted more action. And that's that concerted effort that Murray Sinclair says, hey, folks, nothing's changing unless really there is some action. And so I'm wondering if the three of you would have something to maybe speak in the spirit of Erica, that she would say, just do it. You've got it bad. Now just do it. Is there something you'd want to say to us? Okay, folks listening here, MCC at 100, because this is also a conference to look to the future. What would you say here that would impact the future? With me asking, what do you want to say that we should just do it? Any of you have some words or thought to that? We love prophetic voices, courageous voices. If that works for you, we would be happy to hear your teaching and wisdom to us.
I'd like to say that that church that contacted me, and then I contacted Six Nations Polytech, just follow through, just do it. Go ahead, gather the money, send it there, get the ball rolling. I tell my son, you can steer a car that's moving. If it's not moving, you can hardly steer the thing. Get it moving. So to me, whenever I've talked about that, anywhere across the country, people come up to me and says, how can we do it? Somebody came up from United Church in Winnipeg, said, how can we do a spiritual covenant with our community? Or how do we do that? And I said, there's 4 urban reserves in Winnipeg. Find out which one's closest to you and go talk to them and talk about this. And then just do it. Just go ahead and and maybe even just no strings attached, just offer something right from the word go. And that's a spiritual covenant. I could send it to Wendy if people are interested in it. There's a document that describes it, and somebody could follow through with it. and just get the ball rolling. I've been talking for 14 years. We haven't had anybody take it yet. I'm looking forward to the first one.
Thank you, Adrian. I hear the urgency in your voice. Thank you.
Adrian, I'm wondering if 14 years is half your lifetime. Just kidding. I like to tease people, especially Adrian. He's like my brother. I think the thing I think of is this is kind of like a backwards compliment, I think is what you call them. Like, I get like, wow, MCC is super humble, but like, there becomes a point at which humility is like a non-actionator. Made up that word right now. And I think it's become that point. Like in the US, like MCC, we have and are creating these fabulous doctrine of discovery resources, land acknowledgement resources. No other church group is creating those resources, nor is any other non-church group creating those resources. We have other places like coming to us, wanting to use these resources. And there's like crickets from MCC. And I think some of that is like a humility, but it's like, okay, we get it. You're humble. And can we like, it's not helpful, or like be humble on the weekend? I don't know. There's probably like 3 days humble, 4 days not. There's like probably a way to balance it out that something can come out in which like we can just be like, we have these resources, like, and we can lead the way because like we understand reconciliation, and not that we have it figured out, but we have means and we know people in which to figure it out if we don't know how to figure it out. And I think the other things is just to like prep yourself, because like, I don't know, this is like a big secret, but it's not a secret. This work is gonna involve conflict. And I don't know why everyone gets so surprised when there's conflict. And it's just like, you kind of like secretly sign up for that when you do this work. And everyone then is like shocked and like leaves it and is just like, oh, I had conflict. But conflict, I don't want to say I love conflict because then people think I start arguments. My sister would probably agree with that. But I feel like it's there and it can take you to places and it brings about change, and it's very normal. Like life is about conflict. And so I feel that MCC has all the ingredients, but it just doesn't know what it is in the present time. Like, be present, MCC, because I don't want to be at a conference 100 years from now. Wow, I'd be so old. And look back and say, whoa, we had all that and we didn't even use it at 20%, you know? And so now I'm like, now's the present, and we have these resources. We have people that are super knowledgeable. And I don't think we use them in the right ways to capacity. We use them in the wrong ways over capacity. And so I think it's like getting that titrated out. Wow, me and my language. And so, yeah, it's just balancing it back out in the ways that match our actions or our different ways. And I think we're just cutting edge. And that's one reason I stay with MCC. You know, this is another secret. I was in a non-religious space and I accidentally caught myself thinking, where's the Mennonite in the room? Like, because I wanted that skill set. Like there's a certain, where's the circle process? Oh, why aren't we all figuring this out in a group? Like, you know, I'm like, oh yeah, not everyone does things this way. And so that's why I stay in this space. And so I'm critical because I love the space. And I would find it to be an insincere love to not be critical and love at the same time. And so I think to always clarify that my criticism comes with a bigger hope and a bigger love, that I would not want to be insincere in that.
Thank you. And that reminder of holding the critical in love, I think really is something that can give us potential to propel forward. I'm just going to do an aside here. Adrian did send me his document. So if there is somebody in the room who can email me eventually around a participant list, things can be sent out. So please someone contact me about that. We are going down to the last few minutes here, and Mary Jane, is your internet good enough that I can send a question your way?
Yes, absolutely.
And it kind of is grabbing some of the energy that Adrian and Erica have just been talking about. And we've talked about different emotions. And Sharon Wall is wondering how anger might fit in as an emotion that we might face or embrace in this conversation here. And she wonders how anger, or maybe some other set of emotions, Mary Jane, helps you do the kind of historical work that you do, where you are really uncovering racism within the context of your medical, historical medical research. So wondering if anger is something you bring to that. Does it move you forward in some way, or is there another set of emotions that you would use to describe what gets you through that?
Yeah, you know, it took me a while to realize this, but I can't do the interviews by myself anymore. I need to have somebody else, at least one other person there. And it started to get like that with the photos too. So being able to do the research with other people is really important. And we use sometimes like the kind of post, you know, research kind of gabs, I think, which are really quite important to get through this. And so I guess like, and this kind of ties back to like the earlier question about reconciliation. And I think for me, reconciliation is kind of moved without truth. And this is really not, this work is just not there yet. So I really like, sometimes I feel like there's just so much work to be done. And really there's not very many people doing it, not yet anyway. And so like rethinking methods, especially in archival research, like going with a partner, having somebody else there with you. And I think archives, there was another earlier question about where do you see the hope or where change can happen. I do think that archives have a huge role to play in that. I mean, that it's the responsibility from, you know, the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But I do feel, having worked, you know, in the church records with the United Church, Anglicans, Catholics, and now Mennonites, that, you know, there's been some change over time, being a First Nations person in those contexts, as a, you know, a scholar, there has been some change, but yeah, I think that there's a long way to go too. And so archivists, I think, are really thinking through a lot of these questions right now, and we have a lot to learn from them. I think once you read this stuff as an individual, that you can't unsee it. You can't live that life that you had before you knew. And that means that it's the public's responsibility to read and see and hear. And so we've been living with colonialism for an awfully long time. You know, we've heard from Adrian, like this is 17th century history for us from the East, right? So we can't expect this to go away anytime soon, I don't think. So this is something that we have to kind of be conscious about, I think, about confronting it and seeing it. And yeah, I mean, it's really tough. It's the air we breathe, it's the water we drink, right? Like, how do you see it when it's everywhere? And I think that's what these largely women were kind of confronted. It was just everywhere in their lives, right? Somehow when they went to the United States, they could see Black racism and go with the civil rights movement at the time in the 60s, but couldn't see it in Canada, and they probably couldn't see it in the United States with First Nations people. That is a huge hill to climb, but I think it's the one that we got to do. So I'll say that. Thanks. Again, it makes me mad. Yep.
Thanks, Mary Jane. All of a sudden, I'm sort of feeling, Erica, the way you started us off, that, wow, this day has held a lot, and I'm just feeling a lot of emotion to the beautiful stuff that really the three of you have shared with us this evening. Currie says in his comment, he liked the love and critique comment. Thanks to all three of you, which, yeah, is in my heart right now. Currie also is saying, hey, Mary Jane, MCC could really benefit from looking at this similar medical history in Newfoundland and Labrador, where MCC has long had a presence. And so I don't know if you're looking for a new project, but his thoughts went to your work.
I'd be happy to supervise any master's and PhD students who want to work in this field.
Whew, that is very generous, Mary Jane. I hope folks took note of that. We are at the close of the evening. My heart is full, and I've been breathing deeply as I've taken in your truths, and hope that I can hold the comments you've made to act and not take 14 years and still there's nothing, Adrian. And so the three of you have really called us to trying to hear the truth of our past, opening our hearts to where we are today, and giving us new vision for the future, which is all we have, really. So thank you very much. On behalf of everyone here, the comments, you can take a moment to read through the comments in the chat. There's many thank yous in there to the three of you in terms of how you shared, what you shared, the spirit within which it happened. You've held us and you've pushed us. And so we are really grateful for that. So on behalf of the organizers of this conference and MCC, for who this event is being held, thank you for being part of the story.
Thanks very much.
If there is somebody else that is supposed to be sort of closing things, please do pipe up at this point. But I do want to say that this conference continues. So tomorrow morning at 8:30, the session on operating under authoritarian regimes will be next. It may be slightly different than colonial legacies, but with maybe some common threads to run through. So I wish all of you an evening of reflection as you walk home or pace your living room as you sort through what you've heard this evening. Thanks for joining with us this evening.